Hola, and welcome to Vive Nutrition Radio, the first ever Spanglish podcast where you will hear interviews with the top minds in nutrition, performance, fitness, and health in both English and Spanish. Here is your host, expert registered dietitian, Andres Ayesta, on a mission to help you take your nutrition to the next level. Hope you're ready for this. Let's dive right in.
Welcome back to yet another episode of Vive Nutrition Radio. This is Andres Ayesta. Today we had a great talk with a colleague and friend. His name is Clint Wattenberg, and he is the head of performance nutrition for the Ultimate Fighting Championship Performance Institute, and this is located in Las Vegas, Nevada. And Clint and I go way back. We work together in many different and this really cool handout that we kind of started, this initiative that we started putting some sports nutrition handouts together, and Clint and I worked a lot on this concept on nutrition periodization, and we had a great time working on some of this stuff. So I decided I wanted to bring him in because Clint is an expert in weight cutting strategies, particularly in sports and weight cutting sports. For example, MMA and things like wrestling. He was actually a collegiate wrestler for a long time. He did some MMA when he was becoming a registered dietitian, which is a really interesting story that you'll hear all about it in this episode. But we talked a lot about how performance can be effective whenever we're trying to cut weight too fast, and what are some the different kinds of nutritional strategies that you can implement to do this properly without affecting too much your performance. This episode may not apply to a lot of you guys because not everybody on here in this audience is a professional wrestler or they do any kind of weight cutting sport. However, I think it would be really beneficial for you to get a different side of the coin when it comes down to nutrition and how weight can be manipulated for a specific purpose without affecting how you feel or your performance within that. So we had an interesting conversation about his background and how he became a registered dietitian, and then we went in to talk about some of the things that he does at a UFC, which is fascinating. I've been actually wanting to go visit him and check out the facility that they have over in Vegas. So without further ado, I hope you enjoyed this conversation with registered dietitian and sports nutrition expert, Clint Wattenberg. Hey guys, what's up? This is Andres. Welcome back to Vive Nutrition Radio. Today, as I mentioned in the intro, I have the pleasure of having a great colleague and friend. His name is Clint Wattenberg, and he is, as I mentioned in the intro, the director of performance nutrition for UFC. Clint obviously comes with a wealth of knowledge, as I mentioned, and I wanted to bring him in to talk a lot about weight class sports, specifically, wrestling, because he does have a long history on that. And he's a sports dietitian, and, he's been amazing and a great resource to me. And we've been working together in many different projects in the past, and he's going to chat a little bit about some of the things in regards to weight class sports. So Clint, welcome to the show, man. How are you?
I'm doing great. Thanks for having me, Andres.
No problem. So I would love to kind of start this kind of conversation, Clint, by maybe kind of chatting a little bit about more on your history, because I know you did wrestling, and you come from a long background of wrestling yourself. Mm-hmm. How did this wrestling background started, and what kind of led to you becoming a sports dietitian and kind of getting into the sports from the other side and the nutrition realm of things?
Yeah, like you said, I've been a lifelong wrestler, so to speak. I started wrestling when I was 5, and just really struck a chord with me. The individual team sport nature of it, get to be part of a team, really have some close bonds with the guys and now gals that you get to train and sweat and bleed with, and you kind of your success is limited only by what you put in, the sacrifice you're willing to commit to it. So I grew up a wrestler. I also ran cross country, pretty much, through the same time from age 5 through high school, 18 years old, and committed to wrestling as my primary sport, kind of middle school area. Achieved some pretty decent success in high school. A couple times state place winner, never was a state champion, never quite reached my goals. And kind of the story of my career is near successes have kind of driven me to continue to cultivate my passion and my successes at higher levels. So I was fortunate enough to be recruited and wrestle at Cornell University, which has not only world-class education, but world-class wrestling and a really great program in nutritional sciences. And so I was able to study nutrition. And as we know, clinical nutrition and what I was studying is much more kind of the biochemical mechanisms that are the reactions at the cellular level. I mean, that's a lot of what we're learning. And so I struggled to apply nutritional sciences to my actual performance and my training and my struggles as I actually grew out of the weight class that I was recruited at and that I identified with. And I got thicker. I was the same height in high school as I am now. I was about 45 pounds lighter. And so I grew out of my weight class and struggled to apply nutrition, because the application of nutrition to sport is one thing, but then to weight class sport is kind of another level. And so a lot of the challenges that I still face now working with athletes at the UFC and in amateur wrestling are grounded in the mistakes and the challenges that I faced as a student athlete trying to apply nutritional sciences to my practice. So I struggled. I ended up going up 2 weight classes halfway through my college career, and was able to achieve, my best successes up weight, and have become a big advocate for competing closer to your natural weight, especially for younger athletes, and was able to be a couple-time All-American in college, continued my career post-college, where I was a U.S. national team member for our freestyle national team, what that means is I wasn't quite a world team member. World team and Olympic team is number 1. I was second and third for a few years, and so was able to travel the world representing our country around the world, but wasn't able to do that at a world championship. So was able to really gain a lot of amazing experiences, both competitively and then obviously trying to apply that to myself through that process. And so I graduated college in 2003, trained through the 2008 Olympic trials. In that time, I got my master's degree in exercise physiology at Ithaca College, which is in the same town as Cornell University. I coached. I was on staff for a couple of years at Cornell. Ran a kids club. Kind of led the development of a youth wrestling organization. So kind of been involved in the sport and nutrition in some capacity through 2008. Then went back and got took me at a year's worth of prerequisites in 2008 when I went back to school. And then 2010, I became a registered dietitian, started working with Cornell student athletes. And there wasn't a position there for me at Cornell. Really passionate about helping my alma mater. So I started volunteering at the eating disorder clinic in town. I had very little to no experience at the time, but really just tried to shadow and get some experience. Picked up some and was able to get hired in our health center doing eating disorder nutrition counseling as part of our multidisciplinary eating disorder team, and was able to build that program and then slowly build the sports nutrition program as the time went on. And when I left Cornell in 2017, I was doing mostly sports nutrition with a little bit of eating disorder treatment and a lot of eating disorder prevention, really recognizing that student athlete health and wellness goes way beyond the parameters that we usually consider, and eating well and being well around food and body are really critical to that. Nice. Through that process, I also was fortunate enough to, actually, when I was doing my dietetic internship, the program at Cornell splits time between Cornell and then the clinical rotations up in Rochester, New York. I'd done some MMA coaching. I actually had done wrestling and nutrition and strength and conditioning coaching with John Jones. I cornered him at one UFC event. And so I got into MMA, had a couple of fights while I was up in Rochester doing my internship. So I was doing my rotations. Wow.
I did not know that.
and all the, like the clinical director and the food service director was always like, how's training going? What bruises do you have? And I try not to be too bruised on my face as I was going and working in food service, but that's always it's actually a little bit disarming, having some.
You're probably one of the first dietitians
going into.
You're probably one of the first or the only dietitians that actually compete in the MMA. I think that's something that you can probably add to your curriculum and to your resume.
Yeah. And so interestingly, at the time I was kind of doing it to prove, just to gain experience, to step into the cage, to practice weight cutting tactics. A lot of it was just cultivating experience, street cred when talking to MMA athletes, and just in case something came down the road with the UFC. And shoot, that was 2010. So 7 years later, the Performance Institute was opened, and it was it was a really good fit. I wasn't ready to leave Cornell, honestly, but the fit was just perfect, and it's been an awesome transition.
Wow. What a trajectory, man. And it's amazing everything you've accomplished. And right now I'm trying to figure out where I want to take this conversation, because there's a lot of points that I kind of wanted to cover. I guess like the first one, starting off from the struggle. And I think one of the things that kind of resonated from everything you just said is like you going through this stage, like before you even became a dietitian, before you decided to study nutrition, which was like the struggle, like you being on a performance or in a sport that require a performance level that obviously for competition, but still kind of struggling with the fact that you had to make a specific weight, which at the time, and I know for years there's been tactics and different strategies that have been implemented that actually have gone against the performance aspect of things. So when you talk about the struggle, what do you mean specifically when it comes down to weight cutting and weight cutting strategies within the sport?
Yeah, great question. And a big part of it is the unique application of nutritional sciences, sports science to combat sports. It's the application is a little bit different, even if the science is not. And a great example of how I maybe would have kind of misunderstood the science is I used to, when I was my last season down at 165. So I was living, in the off season in the mid 180s and having to really diet down to make 165. And I would, in the days leading up to weigh-ins, we'd have a couple weigh-ins, 2 to 3 weigh-ins a week, just depending on the tournament and the dual meets period of the season. And I would be eating something like vegetables and rice, thinking, okay, I need to have good energy. Carbohydrates is my primary energy source, and I want to eat healthy food. So I want to eat, so a big bowl of broccoli and some rice. And what I know to be true now is that, I had good energy, but I was limiting my ability to adapt to use fat as an oxidation source. I was providing, I was glycogen loading, which is going to hold water and weight into my muscles. And I was essentially loading my body with fiber, with residue that weighs me down on the scale, but doesn't give me energy. And so I was actually making myself heavier without giving myself the energy to do the actual work and the building blocks for my muscles and my tissue to repair. And so when I think about it now and how I communicate it now is I want to strip my glycogen at the last day or two, and I want to strip my body of the fiber that doesn't give me energy but holds me down. A great example is if I can be more efficient with the amount of energy that I provide, and I go with high fats instead of high vegetable, high fiber, something like broccoli. If you think about how caloric it is to get 500 calories of broccoli, you have to actually get over 3 pounds of that food into your body. Yeah. Now, it's not only the 3 pounds of broccoli, but it's the water that is required to then process that through my gut and to process that residue from my head to my tail. And alternatively, if I want to get 500 calories of nuts or nut butter, something that's very, very energy dense, small amount, it's like 0.2 of a pound. And so I can have that dose of energy, provide very, very little bulk into the diet, provide energy, provide some nutrients, some amino acids and protein to support my tissue repair, and be much more efficient. And so this is kind of an example that I give to a lot of dietitians and those that are considering working with fighters or fighters themselves, in terms of, okay, these athletes are not, ignoring sports science. Oftentimes we think about weight class sports and weight descent and weight cutting as being something that just throws out sports science and sports nutrition. But it's a very unique application because the constraints of competition are so unique. And so it's a really fun puzzle to put together when you're able to do it in a more comprehensive way. And obviously I made mistakes, and that's something that has driven me to continue to evolve as a sports dietitian.
Makes sense. And I think going back to those mistakes, because I feel like a lot of people listening in that may be involved in this kind of sports, whether it's like wrestling, weightlifting, powerlifting, those kinds of things, the mistakes that I've seen, it's usually all related to dehydration techniques. And I think that's one of the biggest issues that we've seen in any kind of weight class sports, which is obviously kind of reducing water intake leading up to a specific competition just to make weight. And then just after that, trying to possibly rehydrate. So what is the biggest problem? Because you talked about the ideal strategy, and we're going to touch base on that. But then we're going to go maybe back to, I guess, like the mistakes that we're actually seeing most of the time, which is like those dehydration techniques. And what are the risks of those? And why is it that it's kind of like the norm for a lot of people to start to incorporate either that or just like not eating at all?
Yep. So I'll start with why, what's often called, kind of like old school weight cutting or just really restrictive weight cutting is the norm and the default, especially for younger athletes, whether they're new to the sport or they're just younger physiological age, is because we're driven by fear, especially around weight. And if you're scared that you're going to miss weight and there's all the pressure on you to not miss weight and to be there for your team and everything else, the first thing you do is you do whatever is going to make you the lightest earliest. And water is very heavy relative to those other things like our foods that are going to be more energy dense. And so if your coach or your parent or yourself are saying, okay, I got to be closer to weight, I got to only be 3% or 5% or 5 pounds or whatever that number is, a metric, the first thing that athletes are going to do is cut their weight. They cut their water out. The weight goes down, but then they're dry. And when you're dry, your body struggles physiologically. We know that you're going to struggle. The starved body can last a lot longer than I do is cut water out. So that's kind of the driving force that I see is that fear factor of driving early dehydration. And to take it a step further, if we can have the kind of overarching plan, overarching philosophy that we want to keep the body as hydrated for as long as we can and as nourished for as long as we can through this process, then that's going to be a good kind of guiding light in terms of what's going to help direct our programming. So as an example, if we can keep hydration high and then cut it at the last second for, to more mimic what you would do in a, hard practice in a hot room, then that's going to be to our benefit. And if we're going to be able to provide calories as long into the process as we can by choosing more energy dense rather than nutrient dense calories, then that's going to be helpful as well. So those are kind of the guiding factors that help determine some of the nutrition and hydration programming that I would set out.
Okay. So, and then what is so I guess if we could define just for standardization purposes, kind of like a cutoff as far as when do we start to see that performance start to be affected when it comes down to dehydration? And what is is there a specific guideline that you try to recommend to a lot of our athletes that you're trying to recommend, whether it's we use with other kind of sports percentage of, body weight and, whenever there's a 1 to 2% dehydration or a reduction on body weight when it comes down to dehydration or dehydration related issues, then you start to see performance come down. And what's kind of the marker or the standard that you try to kind of teach your athletes as far as this to remain hydrated and not kind of hit the dangerous levels?
So it's a little bit challenging to have one definitive level at which point you see a performance degradation. And there's a few reasons why. One, you have to take into account the current weigh-in regulations that we're referring to. For example, NCAA wrestling The athletes have to weigh in an hour or 2 hours before their competition, just depending on the type of competition, whether it's a tournament or a dual meet. In those situations, you cannot lose more than 5% or so of your body weight and regain that and be competitive, because it is too hard to lose and then regain that amount of food and fluid. And so that has a real big performance impact. Anything more than about 5% is what I've found. Contrast that with my current athletes, where UFC events. So the amount of dehydration that the athlete can withstand and then rehydrate and be able to compete at is far different, and is going to be higher than that 5% that I recommend for our college athletes. Taking that another step further, younger athletes, developmental athletes, I'm strongly recommending anybody who's more in a more developmental model and the developmental competitive level to really resist the urge and the kind of the drive to improve performance through weight cutting. Now,
okay,
there's definitely some opportunity to, go get a workout in before you weigh in, and is that weight cutting? I don't know, but to really, for those younger levels, whether it's physiological age or sport age, to resist the urge to cut weight until you're at a higher competitive level, because it does add a lot of miles and a lot of suffering to those athletes that oftentimes is unnecessary.
So then it sounds like, from what you're telling me, that it really depends on the type of weight. I guess the type of competition and the sports organization, and how much time you have available to essentially after weigh-in. Because I guess let's move on to maybe professional, UFC in this case, because I think UFC is a little bit different, because you have, I think, weigh-ins the day before, so they have an entire day. Or is that right? That you have an entire day after to kind of rehydrate, eat again, and those kinds of things, correct? So it makes it, would you say it makes it a little bit easier?
It makes it so that the amount of weight that can be lost and regained is, without negatively impacting performance dramatically, is higher. That amount, I think, is still up for debate, and our recommendations are to use no more than 8% over that week. But that's just a recommendation at this point, and definitely the amount that an athlete can lose and regain is more in that situation. But that also opens up the opportunity for a little bit of abuse.
Okay. And I guess now this is obviously at the time where competition is happening, but leading up to that. So you're taking, for example, an athlete without proper education on nutrition that is just kind of trying to, they're at, let's say, 10 to 15 pounds above their weight class. And now competition times comes around. So we're thinking now more a week or 2 weeks or so like that. And then they obviously go into this extreme, dangerous weight cutting strategies. Now, if you contrast that to somebody, for example, working with you and with the proper education, what is the typical strategy, I guess, during the season? And you and I have worked a lot on things such as nutrition periodization and things like that. And that's a really interesting topic. But what's the typical, I guess, the typical path or nutrition strategy you implement, for example? And let's maybe talk about wrestling specifically, since they have windows after weigh-in that you would take somebody, an athlete like this, just to make sure they're getting closer to their weight.
So the concept of nutrition periodization is really identifying periods of the season where we're working on different strategies to get that athlete in the appropriate differential from their weight class. So in terms of Andres, are you asking about the actual week of making weight or the entire process?
I want to maybe talking, if you think about maybe let's say, you have an athlete that has maybe, I'm not sure exactly how the seasons are set up. For example, let's think about your times in Cornell. I'm guessing wrestling season is around the winter time. So, maybe we're thinking closer to
getting going right now. Yeah.
Semester start. Yeah.
Yep. So the collegiate athletes, they actually have something in October where they have to certify weight certifications where they can prove that their body is the right size for their weight class. So they'll put in a big effort to drop their body weight over that preseason period, usually kind of August, September. So October, they're able to certify, and then they get right into the competitive season. So for Cornell, they're going into their first dual meet and second tournament this weekend. So this is their second and third time down to weight. So the previous month, they're probably, those that have weight concerns are going to be in a moderate calorie deficit, ideally still fueling from the time they wake up till the time they go to bed, ensuring calories bookend each of their higher intensity workouts, and likely doing some additional low intensity cardio multiple times a week on top of their general training plan. So, for a student athlete, this is a lot of time that they're dedicating to their sport, not only for the training competition, but also just for that weight management component of it. Once they do get their body down to kind of the appropriate size where they no longer have to be in a weight descent, oftentimes that additional cardio will start to dissipate and maybe go into more conditioning type work. And then the calories ideally would return slightly more to a neutral energy balance so that they're able to better recover through that season. Some athletes are just big for the weight and have to continue to push that calorie deficit and and drive the energy balance into a negative. And that's where we tend to see more of the longer term metabolic implications. And so the more we can choose an appropriate weight division, and B, get that athlete to the division ahead of time, get them to their target weight where they're then kind of making weight from, the better that's going to be on their metabolic functioning.
Okay. And there's a couple questions that I want to ask about this. So number one would be when it comes into caloric deficit, and obviously student athletes, and we're educating on ways to, I'm guessing you talk a lot about increasing volume of food or like high density, kind of like not caloric foods and stuff like that. But what is like do you have your athletes, especially when you work Cornell, like do they track their calories? Do you kind of give them strategies and ways that they can kind of like stay more on kind of like in track to a caloric deficit? Or I guess the question is, how do they know they're on a caloric deficit kind of leading up to when they're in their season or leading up to the season?
Yeah, no, good question. A lot of it can be used, and especially when I was at Cornell, we were pretty low tech, so I would use metabolic equivalents quite a bit. So just to estimate caloric expenditure based on intensity of the activity, duration, and body mass. That's a pretty good way to eyeball it. And I found to be, especially, for the vast majority of athletes, to compare metabolic equivalents and combining that with resting metabolic rate equations to be pretty effective, and really thinking about addressing nutritional timing as continuing to be a primary focal point. So many student athletes will end up training all day and then eating all night. And that essentially breaks down lean tissue and stores fat. And that's what we really want to avoid as we're supporting athletes' training, recovery, adaptation, and then performance. So what we prefer is my preferred method of targeted fueling is bookend every single workout with the appropriate macronutrients and calories, and then maintain a energy deficit relative to resting metabolic rate. And what that does is allows us to support training and adaptation while supporting the calorie deficit across the day, and allowing the body and the brain to function as the student athlete needs to kind of conduct their business for both as an athlete, as a student, and as an athlete. So that's kind of the gist of how I would program. Bookend every workout, make sure we have energy to do work, and then maintain the calorie deficit relative to the resting metabolic rate.
Nice. Okay. And that's a great strategy. And one of the things that kind of stood out from what you just said, it's also something that I personally implement with a lot of my athletes, which is metabolic equivalents. Can you kind of just for people listening in, so they kind of understand a little bit about what that entails and what that means? Because when we're doing calculations on macronutrients or kind of calorie needs, we always kind of go based on activity factors. And I think a lot of times that can be pretty vague. and could be too broad when it comes down to that. So you're saying that you use metabolic equivalence. Can you kind of like elaborate more on what that is and how do you use it to estimate caloric needs for some of these athletes?
Yeah, so metabolic equivalence is it's a way to estimate caloric expenditure of a variety of activities. The compendium of physical activity is this list of like thousands of different activities that defines how many calories per kilogram per hour does somebody burn doing a specific activity. I mean, they got mowing your lawn, doing your dishes, running on this speed at this incline and everything else. It gets a little bit complicated, but what it does do, what metabolic equivalence does, is it allows us to base our recommendations, our assessment and our recommendations on actual activity instead of using some activity factor, which is so broad and does not speak to somebody's physical output. So I agree with you, Andres. I prefer to base it on somebody's actual expenditure. I've simplified the metabolic equivalence quite a bit. And this is something that I do with my athletes here with UFC. And a lot of it's based on how hard it is to identify the intensity of a specific activity for a specific athlete. As an example, if you and I went into a wrestling practice, same exact practice, our perceived exertion and our physical exertion is probably going to be a lot different. If you're losing positions instead of winning positions, if you're comfortable striking versus not comfortable, the amount of stress and the amount of physical exertion is going to be very different. So I base, because really I have my own estimated METs where I ask athletes to rank the intensity of a training session based on scale of 1 to 10. And then I use that number as the MET. So anything that's an 8, I use that as their metabolic equivalent times kilograms times training duration. And I've compared it to actual metabolic equivalents, breaking down a wrestling practice of 20 minutes of warm up, 20 minutes of skill work, 30 minutes of combat, and then 20 minutes of cool down, however that worked. And it was pretty reliable, and it helped to simply rate, to obviously define energy expenditure, but also then to define physical exertional demands, which then help me to define what type of substrate I'm going to try to fuel with pre-workout for those that we have to really utilize more metabolic efficiency fueling for. So it supports really personalization of our meal plan, but then also helps to fill some of those specific needs as we're doing the programming.
That makes sense. And then when it comes down to, once you kind of estimate the caloric needs of the athletes, and now when you're looking at more like macronutrient distribution, I'm guessing what you typically tend to do is just kind of maintain protein, obviously with certain recommendations, and then you just kind of start manipulating your carbohydrates and fats depending on the time of the season for the athlete, whether they're trying, like you mentioned earlier, let's say, for example, you just need caloric density without necessarily adding too much bulk, depending if you're not trying to add too much weight. So I'm guessing in that case, you lower a little bit carbohydrates and increase fats, or just, is that something that you start to manipulate, or how you work with your athletes?
Yeah. So just like you said, protein timing and consistency throughout the day doesn't change a whole lot. The only time that I adjust that up or down is if we have, more severe caloric restriction, then protein will go up. We'll sacrifice performance. And this is just for weeks at a time, a couple of weeks where we will decrease calories quite a bit, increase protein. Performance will go down during that period. But what that allows is preservation of muscle mass through that calorie restriction. Like I said, that'll only happen for a couple of weeks. Protein might go down if currently we may have athletes that we identify that they have too much muscle mass. So we may need to be in a slight protein sparing. Protein timing becomes critical, but protein density actually needs to thin out a little bit to allow the body to not be extremely catabolic at any given time, but to support muscles to thin out. And that needs to really work concurrently with our physical training that's driving the development of more aerobic muscles and decreases any of the hypertrophic stimuli. So those are the two things that'll change: protein intensity. But then, yep, go ahead.
Well, I was just saying, so you're saying that in some cases you want athletes just to kind of halt muscle growth because you just don't want them to get too big in that case, right?
Yeah, our needs here with MMA athletes is pretty specific and pretty unique in that you can't change your reach. You can't change your range and your height. And so some athletes are going to be, too thick muscularly to effectively and efficiently make weight and may be struggling at making weight. And so that's where adapting the training load, the training stimuli, and the nutritional substrate and the nutritional stimuli to limit the anabolic stimulus and the hypertrophic stimulants. And so that's where I work very closely with my strength and conditioning team to program to help athletes to be thinner rather than thicker muscularly.
Yeah, I think that's huge. And I guess like with that, I've seen, and I follow UFC, but I'm not as a huge, I'm a fanatic just simply because I just don't always watch it. But I've seen a lot of, high profile athletes, and I think it happens at every single level when they're moving like sometimes 1, 2, and 2 weight classes. And they say, I'm going to compete now at a very lower weight class. And I think I've seen some big names actually doing some of this stuff. I guess, in some cases for the competitive advantage. Where do we, or you as a dietitian, where do you define that limit? Because I'm sure there's got to be, like when you're moving classes, like sometimes like 20 pounds down below or sometimes even more. Mm-hmm. I would imagine there's got to be a risk associated with that when you're already at a very low fat, or a low body fat percentage, for example. How do you define mm-hmm. that, and how do you work, I guess, with the strength and conditioning staff? And I'm guessing obviously the bigger guys and agents and stuff like that when it comes down to that conversation.
Yeah. So with my role here, I work for the athlete, and they work with their own team. And there's times where they'll bring in their support team, coaches and managers and things of that nature. But I'm here to work for the athlete. And we've had athletes high profile and not as high profile want to go up a weight, down a weight, and these may or may not be in line with what their support teams are pushing them to do. In terms of going down a weight, it's it's still a work in progress. We're looking at things like body composition around lean tissue relative to their weight division, comparing to their metabolic functioning, looking at some of their blood work, looking at their recoverability, looking at their strength and power numbers compared to themselves in past assessments and themselves and compared to their divisions that they're considering. So we're trying to bring all of those influencing factors into the conversation. But there's no hard and fast way to make that decision. And that's both the struggle and kind of the art of this is figuring out how to best support the athletes in a way that allows them to achieve and support them in their drive to perform, but also making sure that we're setting them up for success on a health and wellness and on a kind of personal level.
Nice. Now, if I was to, let's switch the narrative a little bit more and talk about something that you're very knowledgeable, that it goes hand in hand with weight class sports and just with weight, which is actually body image and the eating disorder issue. Mm-hmm. And I want to kind of spend the last few minutes that we have together to kind of talk about this, because weight is definitely a number that, in whether it's sports or not, drives a lot of people. What are some of the concerns of some of the things that I've seen? Because you're definitely one of the dietitians that I look up to when it comes down to eating disorders, because you've been dealing with this so much. And I think I've seen a lot of predominance, not only because usually it's tend to see a lot in women, but there's a lot of stuff happening among men. What is, I guess, your take on weight class sports and when it comes to body image issues, and what are you seeing happening, a lot of, nowadays?
So, disordered eating and body dissatisfaction are rampant in our society, in our culture, and rampant within sport. And what's really important to recognize is body dissatisfaction and body image are really unrelated to the objective aesthetics of anybody's body shape and size. It's really kind of it's how we see ourselves that is always something that can be better perfected, or there's a struggle where we're trying to control it. So body image, a lot of people will say, well, athletes have these well-crafted bodies and they need, there's an assumption that they take pride in it, but oftentimes it's that struggle of comparing your body to what you consider is a societal ideal. And if you think about athletes in a combat sport like MMA, somebody may consider it to be an ideal compared to what society is expecting, and you may not. There's other sports that benefit from being in that kind of thin ideal weight, gravity sports like cross country, like swimming, like rowing, where the more weight you carry, the slower you're going to be. And so there's a drive towards being towards that thin ideal. And there's other sports like maybe ice hockey or the field aspect of, throws within track and field, or rugby, or, many sports where being thicker may put you at a dissonance related to, our society's vision, view of the ideal. And so that image and comparing it to what the ideal is really what drives that, like I said, the dissonance. And it is actually very, very rampant in sports that we don't always associate with disordered eating, such as, some of the contact sports and team sports. That said, the etiology, the root cause of disordered eating in sports that have weight classes and weigh-ins is much different than the body image etiology in my experience. And I was always very frustrated as a wrestler reading eating disorder statement, disordered eating risk statements for gravity sports, aesthetic sports, and then weight class sports as being high risk. And I consider weight class sports to be very different. And the example is that I'll give is wrestlers. I used to work a lot with lightweight rowers, and now I work with MMA athletes, but they oftentimes will be doing knuckleheaded things to make weight. But once the weigh-in is no longer required, they generally are going back to less of a disordered eating lifestyle than somebody that has a psychological underpinning of disordered eating. And so that's why I consider weight class sports to be a little bit different. Now, sometimes that disordered eating will cause that athlete, that individual, to spiral into more disordered eating symptoms. I find that to very often be associated with underlying mental health risk already. And the symptoms that individual chooses to use is food related, because that was the risk factor that they kind of checked off. But the etiology is generally much different for disordered eating within weight class sports than the body image driven source of disordered eating that I saw much more often in the collegiate setting.
So you're basically saying then that in weight class sports, it's more of like the quote unquote eating disorder behavior. So not necessarily something that it's just essentially kind of like it's just kind of part of it in a way to make the weight, but essentially everything kind of goes back to normal right after. So not necessarily making it something to be flagged as an eating disorder or body image issue. It's just essentially what they do, just to make sure that they get that they make class, they make the weight class that they're looking for, versus obviously the aesthetic sports and those kinds of things where it may be more of like a underlying mental problem that may have, associated with it.
Yeah. And there's always going to be some overlap, right? And so I've seen weight class athletes that have also struggled from mental health issues and disordered eating disorder, but most often once they no longer have to make weight, the severity and the extent with the disordered eating is much relieved relative to the other athlete. Now, when the weight no longer has to be made and there's remnants of this disordered eating, it really needs to be addressed and taken care of. But especially in a collegiate setting, I would say that dietitians and psychologists who address the disordered behaviors within that type of a sporting environment really need to be aware of the sport culture, and that some of these disordered eating behaviors are kind of glorified, right? Go make weight, eat as little as you can, and then go gorge yourself and eat 2 pizzas, or something along those lines. That's very glorified in some ways. And so to brand that as eating disorder, I think is counterproductive. But to understand that it's kind of it's not maladaptive, but just kind of corrupted sport culture, I think is helpful in addressing its root cause.
Okay, that's interesting. Yeah, so because I think it's just something that we just kind of have to understand exactly where people are coming from when it comes down to that, and obviously kind of address it accordingly. Because a lot of times I'm guessing you have to learn how to identify that, and not obviously make a big deal out of something that it just may not be. It's just essentially kind of like a typical kind of eating behavior for somebody that within a specific sport. That's awesome, Clint. I appreciate you kind of sharing all that. Now, I'm guessing just to kind of finish up, I'm sure a lot of listeners are really interested to kind of hear a little bit more about what you do at UFC. And I know that there's I think it's called the UFC Performance Institute, which just opened up, I think, last year. And you're one of the pioneers as far as, kind of working in there. So and you talked a little bit about it, but, what's kind of like the role, or like, what do you guys do over at the Performance Institute, and what is your role within the sport and the people that you're working with right now?
Yeah, the UFC Performance Institute is one of its kind, not only in the sport of MMA, but really across sport. We are a integrated performance team built from the ground up. We opened doors last May of 2017. And we have 4 distinct disciplines with a high performance director. Dr. Duncan French came to us from the University of Notre Dame and English Institute of Sport before that. So he's really coordinating and driving the vision of what we're doing. But the 4 support services that we're providing are performance nutrition, strength and conditioning, physical therapy, sports medicine, and then sports science. And the 4 of our programs are working to support athletes in every effort towards understanding their physiology, their adaptation, and their ability to achieve peak performance. It's unbelievably challenging, being stretched in the sports science. And, I feel like I'm in grad school sometimes. I actually fell off the treadmill 2 weeks ago doing a max test with our sports science director. I was assured that it was a pure max test, so I check that box off. But we're kind of guinea pigs in some realms, but we're really trying to push the sport, but really all the sports science, and building our multidisciplinary team. In terms of performance nutrition, I have a second full-time sports RD, Charles Stoll, who I stole from UCLA about 6 months ago. And then I have 2 interns right now that are doing great work in the food service. One is more geared towards food service, and then the other is more towards the sports nutrition, exercise testing realm. So we're trying to we're investigating all areas of performance nutrition and how it integrates within the human performance paradigm.
Nice. And I love to see that, because I don't think, obviously that's a big initiative from UFC, and obviously within the sport, because I'm guessing you work with athletes that are, from the top level to somewhat like, sometimes like at a very younger ages. Now, is UFC Performance Institute open to kind of like for people to come in and do some of the testing, or this is only directly for people that are part of the UFC organization?
Yeah, it's specialized and limited to UFC contract athletes. We have about 570 on the roster. Anybody under contract, like you said, it could be somebody who's making their debut or is UFC champion, and anywhere in between. They can all use our services completely free of charge. Between nutrition, strength and conditioning, physical therapy, and sports science, we kind of wrap all of our tentacles of knowledge and assessment and give them the best experience, whether it's 2 days or a week or an 8-week fight camp, or some athletes are moving here permanently, and to provide them all the support that we can provide to them, to their coaches, to their skill coaches, to their support staff back home, to support them in their development and their longevity and the consistency of their performance.
Excellent, man. Well, it looks like you're doing amazing work over there, and I'm super, super excited to maybe sometime come to Vegas and go check it out and get a tour of the facility, hopefully. So that's awesome, man. Well, we actually come to the very end of our podcast, and I actually like to do kind of like a fun part, which I like to call a rapid fire questions. So I'm hoping that you're kind of ready to answer maybe just 4 questions very rapidly. The first thing that comes to your mind. You ready?
Hit me.
All right. First thing, what's your favorite exercise and why?
Power clean. It's all about power.
Okay, I like that. All right, we're getting along, man. I love that. Second thing, if you listen to podcasts, if not, it's not okay. You don't have to answer it. What kind of either podcasts or either radio shows or anything like that you like to recommend to people?
Not my area of expertise.
Okay. What about books, or it could be nutrition related or anything related that you like to recommend people?
Anything Bob Seebahar writes, metabolic efficiency training, nutritional periodization are front and center on my bookshelf.
Absolutely. I'm going to make sure I link it up in the show notes to make sure you guys can access to that. Last one, if you were stranded on a desert, or not a desert, on an island, and you could pick one food to have with you for the rest of your life, what would it be?
Definitely a burrito.
Okay. From Chipotle?
That'll fit, but I grew up in NorCal, so kind of the home cooking is even better.
Oh, nice, man. That's awesome. Now, I know, just to kind of finish it off, Clint, that you wrote a book on like an eBook on weight class sports and kind of, I'm sure there's a lot of weight cutting strategies and some of the things that we talked about. How can people get that, or where can people go and try to find that, just to make sure they get? And I want to make sure I link it up on the show notes.
Yeah, thanks. Yeah, so I wrote an ebook called Performance Nutrition for Wrestlers back in 2014. I try to put everything I could into writing just as a resource for everybody. You could find it at mywrestlingnutrition.com. There's also a bunch of webinar type resources that I've done over the last 2 or 3 years, trying to provide as many resources for parents, coaches, sports RDs, and any other kind of athlete support staff to support athletes in their nutritional efforts.
Awesome. And I'm going to make sure I link it up on the show notes to make sure people can access that and you can purchase that and get it for yourself. So you can get more information on this specific topic that we talked about today. So Clint, man, it's been a pleasure. Thank you so much for being here today, man. This has been great. And I definitely love to bring you up in the future, maybe talk a little bit more in depth on the eating disorder and body image issues, because I know you're super an expert on these areas, man. How does that sound?
Sounds great. Thanks for having me, Andres.
Thank you so much, Clint. Have a great night, man.
You have been listening to Viva Nutrition Radio. Couple of things before you take off. If you enjoyed this episode, please, I would love to get your feedback. So feel free to drop down a review, and I will be forever grateful. Also, if you like this podcast, make sure you hit the subscribe button. We have it on iTunes, Spotify, or Google Play. And lastly, if you would like to receive a freebie from me, make sure you sign up for our newsletter at www.vive-nutrition.com. See you guys in the next episode. Ciao, ciao.